Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure. So I'm a civic designer. I'm not an architect, but I like to hang out with them. And what I do as a civic designer is I design civic process. I design ways in which people interact with one another. So I'm going to tell you a story. On a recent warm summer's evening in Boston, Massachusetts, a group gathered in a community center in the city's Chinatown to discuss the placement of digital kiosks and sensors in the sidewalk. This was not a group of technologists. They were local advocates, residents, educators, and teens asked to advise on the city's plan for technology in the public realm. More specifically, they were asked to govern an exploration zone, an area of 4 square blocks in Chinatown where we, in collaboration with the city, temporarily install technologies so that residents could question their usefulness and test their functionality. This was part of a pilot project in Boston called Beta Blocks, an experiment in involving people in conversations and decisions about data, surveillance, and the public value of technology. Would people want air quality sensors in their neighborhood? What would they do with the data? Would they want free Wi-Fi? What if the Wi-Fi beacons were also collecting data about users? Would they want a digital kiosk with local community information? What if it also delivered relevant ads based on who's walking by? Well, if you invite people to talk about data surveillance in the United States, they might bring up Cambridge Analytica, or the Russian collection of facial data from a viral Facebook app, or their fear of city governments sharing data with US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Keep talking, and they may extol the conveniences of automatic tolling stations on highways or responsive traffic signals. The point is, no righteous path exists in the municipal uptake of novel technologies. Do these technologies violate privacy and personal liberties? Do they enhance freedom through mobility and convenience? Do they do all of these things? Well, most data scientists don't even understand everything that can be done with data, so why would cities be invested in consulting the public about things that the experts don't fully comprehend? The answer is that most cities are not so invested. Decisions about sensors, kiosks, utilities, street furniture, and any range of data-hungry smart technologies are typically made by city officials in conversation with tech companies. This is not due to bad intentions necessarily, but to a system that makes no distinction between a park bench and a sensor. For most procurement offices in the United States, an object in the environment and an object that is actively monitoring the environment and the people in it are practically the same thing. But the truth is they are not. When urban technologies incorporate private user data into decisions about shape and function of the public realm, the stakes are higher than when benches are placed. When technology passively collects data from people on the street, either by sensing devices or sensing bodies, a collection process in which one doesn't even have the opportunity to click I accept, then the stakes are higher still. Beta Blocks is an experiment in inviting the public into determining the value of urban technologies. It brings together residents, government, and the private sector to address the problems introduced by these urban technologies. The common sense approach would be to teach people about data and how it's used, allow people to have informed conversations about data, and then arrive at decisions. But the novelty of the problem, that is, the use of personal data to determine what ads to present on sidewalk kiosks, means few precedents exist to model good decisions. With the process muddled by the uncertainty of the novelty and overwhelmed by the technical complexity of the issue, the linear path from information to decision is disrupted. Government organizations tend to prioritize efficiency in decision-making. They are invested in charting a path to a goal with the least amount of friction. But when the problems are novel and decision spaces are complex, efficiency can be at odds with the goal of building trust. The Beta Blocks pilot provides useful fodder for considering alternative paths to public judgment, as the strategy is not to create straightforward approaches to multi-stakeholder decision-making, but to make room for play, for freedom of movement and thought within very specific structures. through the creation of what Gabriel Mugar and I call meaningful inefficiencies. A plurality of people can embrace uncertainty within a clear set of rules for a comfortable amount of time before reaching judgment. And this is also a plug for my new book. The concept of meaningful inefficiencies is inspired by game systems. The decision a player makes to step outside of everyday life and into a play space or magic circle almost always inserts an inefficiency into some larger system of exchange and interaction. The philosopher Bernard Suits, in his book The Grasshopper, describes the experience of playing a game as follows. To play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific state of affairs, which he calls a pre-lusory goal, using only means permitted by rules, which he calls lusory means, where the rules prohibit use of more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. So a pre-lusory goal is typically identified by asking the question, how do I win? And is defined for the player before he or she enters the game system. I win in chess by capturing my opponent's king. Once I understand that, I can enter into the magic circle of the game, which is defined by a set of rules, which Suits would call pre-lusory means, that stop me from achieving my goal, capturing my opponent's king, by the most efficient means possible, which is reaching across the board, picking it up, and saying, I've captured it. These constitutive rules, as Suits would say, provide the restrictions and limitations necessary for play. And interestingly, players accept these rules precisely because they allow them to play. Thus, games are, by definition, inefficient. Play requires the space that contained inefficiency affords. Put another way, meaningful inefficiencies is the productive lag in systems generated by rules which enforce and justify playing. So, participatory budgeting is a process wherein a portion of a city's or nation's budget is given over to public decision making. For example, this can be a meaningful inefficiency. This was first started in Brazil in the 1970s. It presents a goal and inserts lengthy deliberation as an obstacle to achieving it. The result is not merely to slow down the budgeting process, but to open up a piece of the process to public deliberation, so as both to instruct the public in how budgeting works and empower it in shaping outcomes. The outcome of meaningful inefficiencies in this example is to hold space for people, for social interaction, and for moments of productive encounter in which exist infinite possibilities. Without these encounters, organizations dictate a world prescribed by systems predicted by their makers with little room for variability. Most public sector organizations are eager to adopt new technologies or tools that cut the fat or reduce friction in the system, not the other way around. Indeed, there is necessarily a tension between a meaningful inefficiency and what I call a mere inefficiency. When a website loads slowly or one has to wait in 3 different lines at a government agency to renew papers, these mere inefficiencies mostly lead to anxiety and frustration for users. In the rush to address them, especially when introduced to digital tools that are seemingly designed for such a purpose, organizations can easily design against the values of the people they seek to engage. Incorporating dialogue, providing opportunities for the public to explore the algorithm, and investing in building the public's capacity to understand the data being used are all meaningful inefficiencies needed for effective and generative urban governance. So the impact a process like beta blocks can have on a city is tied to its ability to bring multiple stakeholders into conversation around the novelty of urban technologies, without presumption of neat or simple conclusions. The value is in the relationships that form over time, with the process functioning as the rules and mechanics that structure play. Beta blocks brings to light the tension between the certainty of a product's functionality and the uncertainty of its use. It generates an ambiguity that allows relationships to form as people are drawn together by their active questioning. I will go so far as to say that this state of ambiguity is a required condition of participatory city-making around any novel problem. Public policy should be guided by the humble recognition that no one has the answer. Ambiguity in this situation is not a bad thing. It is necessary. But for most practitioners who are operating with deadlines and deliverables, it can be a deeply uncomfortable place to be. So design firms like IDEO have called out ambiguity as a state designers need to embrace. Being comfortable with ambiguity mitigates the tendency for designers or anyone in a consulting position to feel like they need an answer at every moment. Embracing ambiguity gives designers permission to dive deep into understanding the nuance of a particular situation or environment, bringing their clients along on the exploration as they speak with potential users and test out early ideas. This is what it means to be a designer. It means to be comfortable with that ambiguity, to open up that space. But the role of ambiguity in government or public sector work is actually quite different. That it starts and ends with questions about public value means the boundaries defining needs and interests can be far messier and more nebulous than that which a client relationship might contend. To factor multiple stakeholders, including residents and workers and visitors, into decision-making processes, to ensure trust and ownership across them all, to create spaces for vulnerability and play among competing interests requires that practitioners and organizations tolerate a certain level of ambiguity. And for this work to be done right, well beyond simply tolerating it, ambiguity must actually be incorporated into design process. The open-ended exploration of the needs and interests of multiple stakeholders provides the flexibility required to create valuable products and experience. The alternative to being open-ended in these cases would mean accepting the default values of novel technologies and bypassing the complexities and contradictions of working across a range of perspectives, needs, and interests. Ambiguity cannot be a permanent state. So it's good to have, but it cannot be permanent. Indeed, there is no better way to squander trust with people than to accomplish nothing. The designer needs self-consciously to construct a space for play before arriving at specific objects or outcomes. This space for play allows the designer and the stakeholders to reflect upon the moral and ethical dimensions of the design's mechanisms before they disappear into the mundane. So take 311 as an example. There we go. So this is a tool created or incorporated by many municipal governments around the world to enable citizens to report urban problems, like potholes, graffiti, darkened streetlights, and so on. The technology quickly found an application within government operations and is now a regular part of doing business in many cities. In this case, this is a case of a successful urban technology. However, even though it's successful, few groups have challenged the promised value of such a tool. So I want to use 311 as a way of really sort of pressing on what's valuable with urban technologies. Who is best served by this technology? Who is excluded? What kinds of things can users report, and who gets to decide? Where are the inequities in reporting, and what is the responsibility of government to address them? So these questions are difficult, and they may run counter to the goal of increasing government efficiency in solving everyday urban problems. So in the majority of cases, the ambiguity of 311 has been quickly erased for clarity of function. So the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir writes in The Ethics of Ambiguity that it is easy, when faced with ambiguity, to follow the line of least resistance into unambiguity, whatever that may be, she says. But despite the many bureaucratic obstacles to getting things done in large organizations, there is strong drive toward unambiguity by either getting novelties adopted or quickly pushing them into disuse. It is precisely this ease that a product like beta blocks, or a process like beta blocks, resists. It ensures that what might seem like an accepted matter of course will become difficult. Of course, bureaucracies present many difficulties, but some difficulties, as I'm sure you know, are easier than others. Typical bureaucratic difficulty is not generative, productive, or expansive. It is a mere inefficiency. Meaningful inefficiency, on the other hand, carries with it a responsibility to embrace the more difficult form of difficulty, one that inserts ambiguity, but always intentionally. Good urban governance of novel urban problems is never efficient. And as conversations about self-driving cars and data privacy and other such smart uncertainties become more and more a part of everyday life in cities throughout the world, it is imperative that government organizations embrace meaningful and not just mere inefficiencies. In fact, the more complex and novel a problem is, the more inefficiencies should be built into its resolution. The Beta Blocks project has demonstrated that there are big decisions to make about the future of urban infrastructure, and they have to be made with a recognition that cities comprise a plurality of stakeholders with different needs, responsibilities, and desires. As a result, people within government or other large organizations building out urban infrastructure have to start thinking like designers who are conditioned to tolerate, no, to invite ambiguity. The technological future cannot be merely efficient. As technology becomes more and more a part of everyday life in cities, it is only through the incorporation of play that we can assure that cities are more human than machine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Eric, for the great speech and the content you have shared with us. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and it motivates people to be okay with ambiguity at the beginning, and then land safely on the clarity at the end of the journey of working with that. There's a lot of keywords you mentioned: urban technology, getting insight from the data that we are getting, and how we really help us down the road to make a very informative decisions at the end of the journey of that. And now I will leave the stage, the time for the attendee to share any questions they have for Mr. Eric. If you have any questions on that. So no questions. I have a question for Mr. Eric. I want to ask you about your project and what is the process that you are thinking about or working on now?
Yeah, well, I can tell you more. So Beta Blocks is a project that we started, we piloted in Boston, and it's going to be expanding to other cities, first in the US. But again, quite simply, the process is about incorporating opportunities for play towards decision making among multiple stakeholders and constituents. So that has taken the form, as you saw. I don't know if I can get my slides back, but if I can't, but that has taken the form of us installing an inflatable structure that moves around the city, that kind of sparks conversation about urban technologies, right? It's taken a form of a board game that we created that we plop into both community meetings and public spaces, so people can again be inspired to think and reflect on what technologies do for them. And then finally, it's taken the form of temporarily installing technologies in cities so that people can actually touch them, feel them, see their data, play with them prior to the point of them being permanently installed. So this is the work. This is a large piece of what I'm doing at the Engagement Lab, among other projects. But this kind of represents, I think, the need to insert these meaningful inefficiencies into a process that is so quickly becoming hyper efficient, as for instance Google is modeling for us what a smart city looks like in Toronto through its Sidewalk Labs project, just being one kind of example that I think we need other models in order to resist the sort of model of a smart city that is again, hyper efficient and mostly machine and not human.
Yes, and you mentioned about this project, and what other, I would say, presentations that could of technology that you feel more excited to test, and with the same thoughts that you started with in your project.
Sure. I mean, we're doing I'm doing a lot of work around using virtual reality and 360 video right now to not simply to represent what's possible. We saw some great examples earlier about VR or 360 video showing the perspective of someone other than you. So what it's like to be a child, you know, in a city. That's a wonderful example of the possibilities. But then what happens when we can use that technology that inserts people into a space to provide a kind of common space for interaction? So what it does, when you approach a group of people that don't necessarily understand an issue, and you can talk to them or even show them a video and say, here's the thing, it's very difficult to actually get over the abstraction of whatever that thing is, whether it's a part of a city or a possible process. But what's exciting to me about VR is that, much like a game, is that it inserts people into a process and it allows them to speak from their individual perspective. So after playing a game, for instance, someone will say, well, when I did that in the game, I did this, or I thought this. If you watch a video, you say, well, when that person did something, they did that. Mm-hmm. When you're immersed in a virtual reality experience, you do the same thing. You say, well, when I was there, I felt this. And that's a very different starting point for conversation. And for me, that's a part of what it means to use emerging technology as a way of creating opportunities for that kind of play, which starts from the kind of cognitive positioning of yourself into another perspective, and then allowing yourself to generate possible meanings from that perspective that you didn't have even moments ago.
Yes, and it speaks it speaks very much to the reality as well, and it is very real for people. That's why we can rely on and have a conversation about the real output out of this experiment as well.
Right.
Yes. Thank you so much again for sharing your very insightful talk. Thank you for Mr. Eric.